Heads up on a big meeting coming up tonight. In less than 2 hours, in fact, you can weigh in on proposed changes at fossil.
On June 18, 2005, at a remote power facility in the mountains of central Arizona, engineers shut down 2 hydroelectric plants that had been running continuously since before the First World War. Within hours, water that had been diverted through nearly 9,000 feet of concrete flumes for 96 straight years began pouring back into its original stream bed for the first time since 1909. The creek it refilled, called Fossil Creek, had spent nearly a century reduced to a dry, cracked channel for most of its length. What happened to that stream bed over the following months and years surprised even the biologists who had spent years planning for exactly this moment. Fossil Creek begins at Fossil Springs, a cluster of artesian springs emerging from a canyon roughly 1,600 feet deep in the mountains between the towns of Strawberry and Camp Verde. The springs produce an extraordinary, unchanging flow, about 43 cubic feet of 70-degree water surging out of the rock every second, regardless of drought, season, or rainfall. A level of dependable water output that is almost unheard of anywhere in the arid Southwest. That water is also rich in dissolved calcium carbonate, which precipitates out as it flows downstream, building the pale, terraced travertine formations and natural dams that gave Fossil Creek its name and that once supported an unusually rich native aquatic ecosystem. The science behind those travertine formations is worth pausing on, since they are one of Fossil Creek's most distinctive and ecologically important features. As the mineral-rich spring water flows downstream and interacts with the atmosphere, dissolved calcium carbonate precipitates out of solution and accumulates on any solid surface in its path: submerged rocks, fallen logs, plant roots. Over years and decades, these mineral deposits build up into hardened, terraced dams and pools running down the length of the creek. Structures that look almost artificial in their regularity, but are entirely the product of ordinary water chemistry operating continuously over a very long time. These travertine pools create exactly the kind of slow-moving, sheltered aquatic habitat that native desert fish species depend on for spawning and for shelter from predators and flood events, which is part of why the loss of consistent flow for 96 years was so damaging to the ecosystem in the first place, and why restoring that flow triggered such a fast ecological rebound once the travertine forming process was allowed to resume at full strength. In the early 20th century, that same reliability made Fossil Creek an irresistible engineering target. Arizona's first commercial hydroelectric facility, known as the Childs-Irving complex, was built to capture the creek's constant flow and funnel it through concrete and wooden flumes to 2 power stations, generating electricity that, by 1920, supplied roughly 70% of the power used in Phoenix. Constructing that system, running water for miles along the steep walls of a remote desert canyon, using only early 20th century equipment, was considered a genuine engineering marvel at the time. It also nearly killed the creek it depended on. With the vast majority of Fossil Creek's flow permanently diverted into the power system, long stretches of the natural stream bed ran dry for most of the year, every single year, for the better part of a century. By the late 20th century, a coalition of federal agencies, Native American tribes, and conservation organizations, including the Yavapai-Apache Nation, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Forest Service, the Bureau of Reclamation, Arizona Game and Fish, American Rivers, the Center for Biological Diversity, the Nature Conservancy, and the Northern Arizona Audubon Society had begun pushing Arizona Public Service, the utility that owned and operated the aging hydroelectric plants, to consider decommissioning the entire system rather than relicensing it. In an unusually cooperative move for a utility giving up an active power generation asset, APS agreed. The resulting $13 million restoration project became one of the largest river restoration efforts ever undertaken in the American Southwest. Restoring the creek was not as simple as flipping a switch, even though that is essentially what finally happened on the day itself. In the year leading up to the 2005 flow restoration, biologists carried out an extensive native fish rescue and non-native species removal operation along the creek. Species like green sunfish and other introduced fish, along with invasive crayfish, had colonized the lower reaches of Fossil Creek below the diversion dam over the preceding decades and left unchecked, they threatened to overwhelm any native fish reintroduced into the restored flow. Crews treated the affected stretches to eliminate the invasive population, then confirmed success through repeated snorkeling surveys, teams of divers swimming the creek side by side, independently counting and identifying every fish they could find. After treatment, one survey turned up a single remaining green sunfish across the entire treated reach, evidence the removal effort had worked. With the creek cleared of invasive competitors, biologists then faced the challenge of getting native fish back into a canyon with almost no vehicle access. Their solution involved a Bureau of Reclamation helicopter fitted with a 100-foot cable. Native fish held in captivity during the restoration work were loaded into 55-gallon drums, attached to the cable, and airlifted directly over the canyon walls to sites along the boulder-strewn creek bed that ground crews simply could not reach on foot. Biologists waiting below received each drum, transferred the fish into buckets, and hand-carried them the final distance to release them directly into their restored home water. A permanent fish barrier, constructed about 4.5 miles upstream from where Fossil Creek meets the Verde River, was built specifically to keep invasive fish species from the Verde from swimming back upstream and recolonizing the restored habitat. When the two power plants were finally shut down on June 18, 2005, all of this groundwork was already in place, waiting for the return of the creek's full natural flow. The ecological response, once that flow returned, was described by researchers monitoring the site as both dramatic and remarkably fast. Travertine formations, which had stopped actively growing across large stretches of the dried channel, began rebuilding almost immediately as mineral-rich water resumed flowing over exposed rock. Native fish populations, reintroduced into a habitat now free of major invasive competition, began re-establishing themselves throughout the restored creek. Lowland leopard frogs, which had been pushed into a handful of isolated remnant pools by the decades of reduced flow, expanded back across a much wider stretch of habitat as connected, flowing water returned to the canyon. Fossil Creek today supports 9 native fish species considered endangered, threatened, or otherwise of conservation concern in Arizona, 7 of which were directly reintroduced as part of the restoration effort, making it one of the most significant native fish conservation sites in the entire state. The surrounding riparian corridor has been described by biologists as the most diverse in Arizona, supporting more than 30 species of trees and shrubs and over 100 documented bird species along a creek that, for most of the preceding century, barely existed as functioning habitat at all. The Yavapai-Apache Nation's involvement in the restoration reflected a connection to Fossil Creek that predates the hydroelectric project by many generations. The canyon and its perennial spring-fed water had long held significance for the tribe and other indigenous communities of the region, whose historical use of the area's reliable water source and surrounding lands was disrupted when the diversion project claimed the vast majority of the creek's flow in the early 1900s. Tribal participation in the decades-long push to decommission the hydroelectric system and in the restoration planning that followed represented not just an environmental partnership, but a direct link between the site's modern ecological recovery and a much older relationship with the same water that the Childs-Irving project had interrupted for nearly a century. In 2008, engineers returned to the original diversion dam and removed its top 6 feet, a partial but symbolically significant modification. The remaining portion of the 25-foot structure was deliberately left in place, both to reduce the cost of full demolition and, more importantly, to continue functioning as a barrier against invasive fish attempting to move upstream from the lower watershed, exactly the same purpose the newer barrier downstream was built to serve. In 2009, Congress formally designated Fossil Creek as a wild and scenic river, only the second waterway in Arizona to receive that federal protection, and the state separately recognized it as an outstanding Arizona water. Historians of American river restoration have noted that the Fossil Creek project holds a particular distinction. It was only the second time in United States history that a dam had been decommissioned purely for environmental reasons, following the more widely publicized removal of the Edwards Dam in Maine in 1999. Unlike Edwards Dam, whose removal was driven substantially by the commercial and recreational value of the migratory fish it blocked, Fossil Creek's restoration was carried out almost entirely on behalf of native fish species, with little to no commercial or recreational fishing value at all. A restoration undertaken for the sake of the ecosystem itself rather than for any angler's benefit. Fossil Creek's restoration also fits within a much broader shift in how American water management has approached aging dams over the past few decades. For most of the 20th century, dams were treated almost exclusively as permanent infrastructure, built once and maintained indefinitely, regardless of their original purpose. By the 1990s, a growing number of engineers, ecologists, and regulators had begun questioning that assumption for a specific category of aging, low-value dams, structures that were expensive to maintain, provided only modest power or water storage benefits relative to their ecological cost, and were approaching the end of their functional design life anyway. The 1999 removal of Edwards Dam on Maine's Kennebec River is often cited as the opening chapter of this movement, the first time federal regulators ordered a dam removed specifically because its environmental costs, primarily blocking migratory fish like Atlantic salmon and shad, were judged to outweigh its remaining economic benefit. Fossil Creek's decommissioning 6 years later extended that same logic to a southwestern desert stream and a set of native fish species most Americans had never heard of, proving the underlying argument was not limited to salmon rivers in the Pacific Northwest or New England. The project's success eventually created a problem nobody had fully anticipated. Word of Fossil Creek's turquoise pools, travertine terraces, and waterfalls spread rapidly once the restored creek became publicly accessible and visitor numbers climbed sharply through the early 2010s. By the summer of 2015, the creek's limited parking areas were reaching capacity by 7 in the morning, turning away hundreds of visitors a day and creating serious traffic and safety problems along the narrow forest roads leading into the canyon. In response, the Coconino and Tonto National Forests introduced a reservation permit system in 2016, capping daily access at roughly 740 visitors across the area's designated parking lots. Today, Fossil Creek draws an estimated 60,000 visitors a year, a river now so popular that managing human enthusiasm for it has become almost as significant a challenge as the original ecological restoration was. Invasive crayfish presented a particular challenge during the restoration process that native fish alone did not. Unlike fish, which could be removed through targeted treatment of specific stream reaches, crayfish had thrived in the altered, warmer, slower-moving conditions that existed below the old diversion dam for decades, competing directly with native aquatic invertebrates and preying on fish eggs and juvenile fish alike. Restoring full, cold, fast-moving flow to the creek changed the physical conditions crayfish had adapted to exploit, and combined with the direct removal efforts undertaken before the 2005 flow restoration, helped suppress their population enough for native species to re-establish a foothold, though land managers have continued monitoring the creek for any resurgence in the years since. Consider the scale of that reversal. For 96 years, Fossil Creek existed largely as an engineering afterthought, a water source valued almost entirely for the electricity it could generate rather than the ecosystem it could support. A single decision to shut down 2 power plants and let that water find its old channel again was enough to rebuild travertine formations, re-establish 9 native fish species, expand frogs and bird habitat across the most diverse riparian corridor in the state, and, within about a decade, turn a barely visited desert canyon into one of Arizona's most sought-after natural destinations. It stands today as a rare example of a river restoration undertaken not because a valuable fishery demanded it, but simply because enough people decided the creek itself was worth bringing back. If stories like this one about a desert river finally allowed to be a river again are the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe and I will see you in the next one.